Right, it's preparing to live stream the meeting. So I'll tell you when it's starting to stream.
Well, we say we're
streaming. You can go now. Start now.
Okay. Well, hi everybody, and welcome to this Open Labour Zoom meeting, which the subject this time is on the left's response to the crisis that we're currently going through with COVID-19. And we've got a great panel for you this evening. We have Rachel Maskell, who is, of course, the Labour MP for York, and also a member of Love Socialism, Hate Brexit. Hi, Rachel.
Hi
there. We have Paul Mason, which I'm sure everyone will recognise, philosopher, author, etc., etc. Hi, Paul.
Hello, how are you doing?
Very good, nice to have you with us, thank you. We have Jessie Jo Jacobs, who is the Labour candidate for Teesside Mayor, supposedly in May 2020, but I don't think that's going to be happening now. Welcome to you.
You're
Jessie,
muted.
Oh, is she muted? Oh, yeah, she went out and went in again. Hold on, let's unmute her. There we go.
Hi, how are you doing?
Okay, you're with us, thank you. And of course, we have Open Labour's own Alex Sobel, who needs no introduction, I'm sure.
Who's having some YouTube technical difficulties, so I'm going to be doing that while you talk for a minute.
Okay, well, the subject of tonight's discussion is, obviously we're all, I have my very fine lockdown beard going on, and we're all in the midst of this crisis. What I'm going to ask the panel members to do is just give us a couple of minutes to sort of give their ideas of where we are at the moment, what their ideas about perhaps how we're going to come out of the other side of this crisis. And then we'll have a couple of questions from me as the chair, and then we're going to open it up to everyone in the room to ask some questions. That's how it's going to work. We're going to go on hopefully until about 9 o'clock. I think Paul has to go slightly earlier, but that's how we hope it's going to work. We've had quite a few of these meetings now in the last couple of weeks, and they've all gone pretty well. So let's hope this one does too. So we'll start off, if we can, with Rachel, and what your response, what your ideas and what your responses are to what's going on at presently.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that we're witnessing at the moment is how in a supposed democratic society, the voice of people have been completely removed. And I think if we're looking to rebuild, we've got to think about agency and voice in the future, and how do we ensure that we have a real solid voice from our communities to determine the future. So it's fair enough grand ideas being spoken, but where are those ideas generated from and how are they put? So I think we really need to think locally and nationally. How do we ensure people across the party, but the wider movement, but also civil society actually have a real franchise on their future? So do we go down the road of looking at citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy? And how do we get a grip on some of those really crucial issues that we need to be discussing, shaping our economy, our public services, of course, moving them from where they are as a system of last resort into first resort, shaping civil society and ensuring we see a democratization of our communities. And of course, if we're looking at that agenda, we need to think about how do we build resilience and equality moving forward. I think we've always seen the safety net, but do we want to raise the level of the net to ensure that we have got a far more inclusive society as we move forward, particularly looking at the new formats of delivering services, which have very much come to the fore. But as a result of that, we're going to need a new skilled economy working in a different way. So I think we've got some real opportunities, but we need to ensure that the voices and the power sits in the right place. And clearly at the moment, it does not. We are seeing less accountability, not only of national government, but local authorities, and that lack of scrutiny which is going on at the moment, which is really curbing residents having a shape on the future. We also need to look at where priorities sit in the future, which again, we trust will change. And how do we ensure that those priorities, which are about building a more secure society and economy, come to the fore? So looking again at a different model of business, looking at a different model of how social capital works and how we glue things together with our public services. And of course, looking at the role of civil society as well, which I will be in my role overseeing the charity sector. So how do we put that glue around the way that our communities are operating to ensure once again that people are very much at the forefront, as opposed to, as things have been for far too long, seeing the markets driving things forward. So I think we've got a real opportunity, but we need to get in there fast, because already we're hearing the words around another decade of austerity, moving forward into a more regressive politics, which we know simply doesn't work. Living proof is the way that the whole coronavirus situation kind of took hold, and then how it has been managed to date. So I believe we not only need to make sure we've got voice and agency, but also the tools in order to shape our democracy. And I think politics has got to be done in a very different way moving forward, but we've got to get a grip of that now in order to shape that agenda as we move forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rachel. That's very interesting. And there's some, I'm sure there's some points there that people will pick up later in the meeting as well. Paul, can we hear from you?
Yeah, okay. I just want to say three things: one short term, one medium term, one strategic. And I'm just going to focus mainly on economic policy and the economy, because that's where I've been focusing a lot of my research and writing. And incidentally, there's a very vibrant and useful left economic sphere emerging in this, both nationally and internationally, which the party needs to draw on, and it isn't at the moment. So short term in the UK, the straight to the point thing is the fiscal stimulus is massive, but it's not working. Sunak has committed something like 15% of GDP to these soft loans from the Treasury to business, but they're not being taken up because, especially now, if you look at this leaked thing to BuzzFeed, the exit plan, most pubs won't open until September. If you own a pub, why are you going to take a loan out? Nobody's taking the loans out, and they can't get them when they try. So the loans, which is where most of the fiscal stimulus is, just don't work. What is working a bit is the employment support, so keeping people in work for big companies, and some of the loans to big companies are working. But eventually, what economists are worried about, they call it scarring, and it's literally your local pub never reopens, your coffee bar never reopens, your university could go bust. Now, I think as this drags on, this will become the agenda. As the infection rates peak and fall back, the agenda is the economy's screwed, and that is true. Nobody now expects a V-shaped recovery. It's going to be more like the Nike swoosh, even if they get it right. So that's point one. And I think that the party needs to, and the left need to push very hard for a proper fiscal and monetary stimulus. And what's the missing bit? Yes, they've printed 200 billion. Yes, they've pledged something like 330 billion on fiscal stimulus, but they refuse to take control of the economy. So, I think we should be pushing harder on, you need to take command of the medical goods sector and actually just take control of it. And then say to Burberry and Barbour, you're making PPE. That's what they won't do. No, the more long-term thing is we have to, I think my advice to the Labour front bench would be stop thinking about fiscal policy, interesting though that is, and start doing macroeconomics. Because our manifesto pledges from 2019 are spent several times over now. They said it was too much, but the 83 billion that we wanted to do tax and spend, and the 400 billion borrow and spend, well, they are already borrowing 330 billion, and they've printed 200 billion extra. So their stimulus is bigger than our entire 10-year program. Now, what does that mean? As Rachel said, they're already asking the question, who pays? And traditional economics say there needs to be austerity for 10 years. So you can kiss the NHS goodbye, you could kiss the Green New Deal goodbye, all of that. We must fight that battle now, ideologically. And I'm afraid the problem here is Labour's front bench And Labour, even under Corbyn and McDonnell, were never prepared to instinctively think about monetary policy. So the classic Labour response to a situation like this is tax the rich. Well, there's not enough money in the rich unless you can bring Google and Amazon onshore to pay for what we need to do, even to pay for this fiscal stimulus, let alone to then do infrastructure, then do Green New Deal. It has to be done through a combination of fiscal and monetary policy. And Labour has had nothing to say about monetary policy for decades. My position on monetary policy, the same actually as Jim O'Neill, who's a crossbench peer, ex-Tory, ex-Goldman Sachs, is you print as much as you need to and you buy the government's debt. It's just as simple as that. And John McDonnell would never go there. And I think we're going to have to go there. And I don't know where Annalise is on this, but I sense there's a huge, I mean, basically at the moment, the Bank of England is to the left of Labour Party on monetary policy. It's further down the route of that left-wing American monetary theory than we are. Final point, I think we can build a social coalition to do something radical after this is over. Many of the people, we have to remember, many of the people who were against us before on austerity will not be against us now. And I think that the question is, for what? Here, I'm just a troublemaker. I like to throw a grit into the oyster. There's this unresolved debate inside the Labour movement about, are we in favour of a sustainable, well-being focused economy with, less work and save the planet? Or are we traditional Keynesians who just want to nationalise the railways and raise wages? I sense globally, but especially in Europe, the Netherlands, Germany, etc., a coalition is now building for what you might call sustainable economics, a sustainable economy focused on people, not necessarily focused on work and wages and building things. And I think that existential problem that I've always found inside Labour, even inside the left, is going to have to be addressed. Now, I'm quite happy to make a social coalition with anybody on whoever wants, trade unions, etc. But the fact is that we cannot go on ripping this planet's biosphere apart. Otherwise, zoonotic viruses are going to kill us all. And that means the development story of Asia has to change. And it means the development story of Britain has to change. But I've spoken long enough. Those are the kind of three things that are on my mind at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. And lots of points there, and I'm sure we'll come back and there'll be questions about some of the things you just raised there. Can we come to you, Jessie?
Yeah, so I'm going to, in complete contrast to Paul, I'm going to talk about a very micro and a local economics. I'm standing as a Tees Valley Metro Mayor, so as you'd imagine, I'm thinking a very place-based, strategy of what we do post-COVID. And I want to share a few thoughts from the ground really about what's happening. And I think there's something very unique that's happening at the moment that I think we need to tap into. And that for me has been, the crisis has absolutely exposed the weaknesses in the system, from the welfare state to housing and land and the foundational economy. It is absolutely creaking, and it is absolutely apparent now how weak and how creaking the system is. But at the same time, I'm also seeing real opportunity for change, and the change is in the norm of the value system that we're all living by. Because automatically, overnight, we saw the springing up of all of these mutual aid groups, these hundreds, thousands of groups and people who were, within 24 hours, were organised, mobilised to care for their neighbour, to start food projects, to set up driving, sort of picking up prescriptions, but also further. And there's something, if we start to dig in to that value and that movement, that I think we should be thinking about. And I've been really thinking about what would kind of radical localism look like, because a lot of the things that we see online, like teaching our children PE in the morning or gigs that they're all being done for nothing. It's not for profit. We've been told for a long time the norm is commodification, this is all about you know, sort of a monetary value, and yet none of this is being done for a monetary value. It's being done on a very different, much more what I call a solidarity economy. So how do we keep that going post COVID? How do we keep this idea that actually we're not individuals and there is a society, and that's where I think we need to start thinking about the local government and what would radical change look like at a local government level. And some of the interesting partnerships and coalitions that have happened here in the Tees Valley is when there's been a real partnership between the public, the private and the community. And the responsive and the flexibility of the state to respond has been, in some local authorities, phenomenal, and others they're really struggling because they haven't gone with that kind of movement. So I think there's some really practical ideas of what we can do, and also it feels like it is the moment for localism, and there are some great examples of you know, sharing platforms that are cooperative and locally owned. Like if we want to create, you know, I want to create an alternative to the Amazons and the Etsy's and the Ubers, and I want that to be done at a local level. And I feel like this conversation even 2 months ago wouldn't, particularly for a place like Teesside, just wouldn't get a look in. And yet now I'm speaking to people in the music industry, I'm speaking to people in publishing, I'm speaking to people in food, and they recognise for us to come out the other side, yeah, we maybe have to try something different. Like they're facing existential crisis. And so when we talk about what would a radical localism, how could we really build our local economy in new ways, it's being heard and people are really up for the conversation. So I'll kind of share a little bit more about some of my thoughts about how we can mobilise and provide the infrastructure for some of that going forward. If you hear growling, that's my dog.
That's fascinating and absolutely right. Yeah, it's, some fascinating thoughts. Thank you. Alex, we'll come to you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to use an analogy to start with. If you know, it's really a good idea for you in sort of current society to be lean and fit, and maybe just have exactly what you need, the amount of water, the amount of food that you need for that day or that week. And I think the analogy is that is what's happened. That's what happened to our public services, not just public services, and manufacturing. But if you then are dropped in a desert, then you need to have some fat, you need to have some water, you need to have some food to last you. And we have been dropped in the desert now. Our public services don't have the fat, don't have the spare capacity, don't have the water, don't have the food to feed it. And that is why we're in the crisis we are in. But the same actually goes for our manufacturing. So we've been operating on this system where what we need will arrive just in time after it's been made, usually in East Asia, and we don't make it here. And actually we're now in the crisis. We're in these two crises are locked together, and it's formed this deeper societal crisis. So not only have we got the virus and we haven't got the public, you know, the number of ICU beds, we haven't got the staff in the public services, in care homes, in the NHS, in the councils to deal with it within the police. We also don't have the equipment because one, we haven't stockpiled it, and even if we had, two, we haven't got the manufacturing resource to replace it, particularly with PPE. So we are in the crosswinds of these two crises, and effectively our policy needs to be built on the fact that we cannot repeat these two crises. And we're just thinking now about pandemic, but a whole range of new crises can hit us, both man-made and natural. I mean, you could argue about this virus, about that, but we won't go there. But you know, the changing climate is going to create, you know, extreme weather events, natural disasters. All of those things also are going to become more frequent with climate change. So for me, in Open Labour, we talked a lot about a new industrial settlement, and we've been thinking about that solely in the context of the climate. We now need to think of that much more broadly. And we need to think about a new industrial settlement that means that we create a resilient society. Because actually what's been happening for, and I remember working in the voluntary sector 15 years ago, we were trying to build resilience, had forums, all of that. We're very good at talking about it and writing papers about it, but we aren't actually creating societal resistance within our public services and with our manufacturing sector. And so we need to move from the sort of planning and the sort of, you know, sort of fallback resilience to actually having this sort of front-footed resilience. And I think there'll be a number of other things in the recovery phase and going forwards that we need to think about as well. So, you know, some of the things that have really hit us hard are things like nurseries saying they're going to go out of business because their business model doesn't work in this context, and dentists are going to go out of business because their business model doesn't work in this context. Well, Labour has an answer to that, doesn't it? Why isn't childcare universal basic service run by the state and the third sector? Me and Rachel probably would support that in our roles in Shadow DCMS. And why is dentistry operating like it is? So why are we not thinking about dentistry? You know, obviously there will be private dentists and there will be private childcare providers, but the state must play a much bigger role, and we must have a much bigger role for the not-for-profit sector. And why are we thinking about having these universal services and bringing them forward? And we say to people, these are not just, this isn't about ideology, this is about us having these services here, so that that you can utilize them in a universal way, but also something goes wrong, then they're not going to fall over because they're not run by a limited liability partnership or a family. And they're certainly not going to run out of money because the state is backing them. And I think there's a big, I mean, I support having a universal basic income now and a universal basic income in the recovery, but I think there's a much broader debate after that about whether, as socialists, we should support universal basic services model or universal basic income model, or whether there should be some mix of the two. Because my background issue, we'll probably get into more later, with universal basic income is, you gave everybody the money and they all spend it with Richard Branson, that would just make Richard Branson rich. And that really wouldn't help us societally. So it's, you know, it's about thinking about those sort of issues as well. Yeah, and I mean, what we need to think about is this in the context of that sort of macroeconomic policy that Paul was talking about. And if we're going to have to utilise either quantitative easing or at the moment they're using the ways and means function of the Bank of England, whichever way you're creating the money, where is the money going? What's the destination for the money? The destination for the money is in within the financial sector, and then it trickles down into the productive sector, then we're not solving anything. So, you know, we need to think about the new industrial settlement in terms of macroeconomic policy as well.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So that kind of leads straight onto, I knew you'd sort of tread on my toes a little bit, straight onto the first question I was going to put to the panel, which is about, you know, an industrial settlement for the future, and also how that leads into you know, global issues around globalization, about, of course, the other big issue that's almost been forgotten in the midst of this crisis, which is Brexit, and how we are going to separate properly and safely from the European Union and the knock-on effects of that. But yeah, the question really being, you know, we at Open Labour have been talking about a new industrial strategy for some time, and you know, the knock-on effects of how in this country we've become such a sort of service-based industry and financial services-based industry, the knock-on effects of low trade union engagement in that as well, and therefore issues around solidarity of the working class. You know, what are the crises and opportunities that this crisis has presented in that respect? And we'll come to you first, Rachel, if that's okay.
Okay, I think we've got to look back at our manifesto, and what we were very much saying in our manifesto is that we would place, for instance, trade union members on a board within and give them some sort of voice within an organisation. But if we're very real about this isn't proper industrial democracy, which is what we need to see in order to shift where the power sits within our economy. And that's very much, I think, where we need to focus, because the reality is there'll be a tokenism of voice, but actually it wouldn't actually have the power to bring the leverage that's needed in order to shift the mainstay policy. So I think what we have to really have a look at, and partly this is about kind of look at the kind of real democratization of industry, but also shifting that beyond to how it links then into wider democratization of civil society, is where do we want the power to sit? Because if we are just saying nationalize industry, all we're going to do is put the power into the hands up from the private sector, say, into the state, but actually we're still not going to have a collective voice in there, and therefore it still have its limitations on delivery. And if we are going to make sure services, whether that is around a house building agenda or infrastructure, or whether it is around the city or other forms of industry, if we're going to get a society pulling together, we are going to have a look at where that power sits and how that is leveraged into ensuring not only just workers having a voice and having a stake over their future, as opposed to the tokenism, which we very much see. It's like the pat on the head. You can have your pay rise, and then the kind of trade unions say, well, hey, we've achieved something. Actually, what we want to see are the workers driving forward the next generation of their industry. So what does that mean for skills? What does that mean for enabling us to shift into a new, say, high-tech economy, or more a socialization agenda? So I think we have to look at power and how that is balanced in the future, and therefore where before we kind of say this is a model and this is how we want the city to operate, or this is how we need a business to operate, or even state-run services, we've got to look at how that is shared between a collective community voice in order to have real power to deliver into the communities, but also integration then into the services. So in the scenario that we're in, if we wanted a manufacturing structure around PPE, which is something we were calling for a month ago, we can just switch on and say, actually, these industries now have to manufacture masks instead of coats or whatever the things are. And I think it's only when we address power, if we're honest with ourselves, and we're actually going to bring about the economic shifts that we need to see in order to make civil society work for a collective good. And therefore, I think we've got a real challenge, instead of saying a couple of trade union members on a board, to actually say we need a whole democratization of the industrial piece. So I think that's certainly one area, but also where are the responsibilities sitting within this? So if we look at saying the climate is important, civil society is important, the markets being a servant, say, to our NHS and our public services, as opposed to the masters of, then we have to look at how that relationship is realigned. And I think there's a public appetite for that if Labour is bold enough to get out there and say that. And I think we've got to run with the wind of this crisis at the moment to say, actually, if we're going to put climate at the forefront, now's our chance to make the move on that, to re-establish a relationship between how state, money, markets and the people work in such a way as to drive forward a very, very different economy. If we don't grasp it now, then I'm afraid some of those kind of established principles will continue.
Thank you, very good, yeah. Paul, would you like, can you answer that?
Well, so at this, quite early on in the crisis, this Australian investment group, Macquarie, put out a note basically saying communism is coming. I mean, literally, that's what it said. And what they specifically said was that, and see, in my job, I get to speak to slightly more intelligent members of the elite than Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab. And this is it's almost in the Davos elite, it's now accepted that the whole model of capitalism is going to change. Now, what the Macquarie statement was very extreme, but it accepted basically three principles. One, lots of state ownership will be necessary because, you know, they'll have to part nationalize BA and Virgin, okay? But then when this is over into early 2022, who's going to buy BA shares? Why would you buy BA shares in your pension portfolio? Because there'll be another virus in 5 years and it will wipe it out as well. So state ownership, I think they're coming round to. The next thing is, weirdly, basic income, and we know the basic income has always been a right wing thing, but let's face it, it is necessary now because you need to get money straight down into people's pockets. So I think that the third thing is what I talked about earlier, which economists call monetization. That is, the central bank prints money and buys direct the debt of the state. So you forget central bank independence. You admit it's a delusion, and basically that central bank money printing becomes like a bridging loan from the future, because you can't borrow enough money from your own or take it from taxpayers. Right now, the reason I'm going through this is because I think there is a perfectly rational right-wing version of this that says, state ownership. So what does that mean? We prop up Richard Branson. We prop up the International Airline Group, which owns BA. We prop up BMW in Oxford, Nissan in Sunderland, but we don't do anything for the working class. Likewise, with the basic income, it's meager. And at the same time, you're withdrawing services. You're trying to do austerity look at what local councils. And I mean, Jesse Joe mentioned this, but local councils are really feeling the pain right now because they're not getting enough of the fiscal stimulus. And then thirdly, on the monetization of the debt, well, you just basically you run up the debt, but then you say, because we're so committed now, 400 billion, I think it'll end up something like 120% of GDP, debt to GDP. It's 75 now. You then say, we can't do climate change. Now, in other words, I'm desperate to get Labour politicians to forget the past. The past is over. You've got to start thinking about how we will fight in a period when the elite are committed to nationalisation, basic income, and monetisation of the debt. And what I would say in the short term, look, I think it was you, Steve, said, well, how is this going to affect globalization? I think globalization is going to go into reverse, and there's nothing we can do about it. It is logical for me and you, everybody listen to this, to want there to be at least one vaccine manufacturing plant in Britain, or some PPE plants, right? Now, that doesn't mean we're against the Chinese working class or the Tunisian working class. It just means we need, if you replace PPE with food, then you'll realize how absolutely essential it is that we have a food industry. There's going to be an element of deglobalization. And if you read the IPPR's social justice report, it called for smart reindustrialization of Britain. And I think that should be one of the things we can fight for. So, we're not doing this because we don't like Chinese workers in Shenzhen. It's just the fact that we don't want to be able to rely on them when between us and them, there's Trump, in Turkey, literally grabbing supplies out of the supply chain. So there'll be an element of renationalization of finance, of renationalization of production. In it all, I would argue that one of the things the left can contribute is state-directed investment. You have to be able to say, all right, well, we need that BMW factory in Oxford to survive. So we need for it to be supported. And it won't be fair. No, because, it won't be fair because we'll be paying its workforce to do nothing, probably for about 9 months or a year. We're going to do that. One final thing I'd say is an immediately winnable goal. And it's it runs against the grain if you've been on the far left, but one of the best things that happened in the early part of the crisis was the TUC's ability to force the government to give that 80% of income in the employment support package. This was partnership in action. And actually, it was partnership because the TUC and the CBI went in together. And at sector level, you think about defense, automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals. We're strong. The Unite, CWU, Prospect, they're all strong in these areas. GMB, we can go further there because I think we can say, I know this doesn't answer anything for somebody stuck on a council estate in South Shields or whatever, Jesse Joe. I mean, so this is literally for that part of the working class that is employed that is unionized and is represented, we can have a very easy set of easy wins where we come out of this with actual partnership, actual tripartite style, 1970 style, workers on boards, workers at a national level in a strategic planning unit. And there's 2 DCMS shadow ministers here. So the point is, actually, even in the culture sector, that is also possible. I would be getting Equity and Beck to go to the theatre sector and offer. You have to offer things, like there's things you have to offer and then things you can get back. Likewise, the PFA and the football, there's lots that we can actually do as a movement to build up a new partnership that will completely screw neoliberalism if the neoliberals try to bring it back.
Thank you, Paul. We'll go to Jessie Jo, please.
So I think we need to look at alternative financing. So again, if we want to see alternative business models, cooperative owned, community-led community businesses, we need to stimulate those types of institutions and those types of organizations. And at the moment, it's because of venture capital. If you've got a great idea, and I guess this relates more to tech industry and these sort of sharing platforms, but if you think about the amount of our economy that is dominated by the tech world, for instance, like if you want to set up a social tech industry, a company, the ability to get finance is pretty much non-existent because your venture capitalists want to put money into something that's going to create loads of profits for shareholders. So we have to have an economic stimulus for those types of socially driven organizations to be able to provide an alternative to your Amazons of this world. And there's loads of examples across, like food, for instance, and at the time, and retail. At the time, there was a big company that started called it's called Not on the High Street. It's one of these, you buy your clothes from Instagram, and it's huge, but all the profits from that company have been distributed to shareholders. At the time, there was quite a few other similar organizations that wanted to set up, but they couldn't get the access to finance because they had more of a cooperative, socially driven purpose. So I think it's absolutely vital that we have a national investment bank and regional investment banks, and was really supportive of Jamie Driscoll's when he launched his Metro Mayoral campaign to try and kick that off in the Northeast. And at the same time, we need to be able to give innovation funds to startups. And one of the things that I think has been quite interesting, even like during the crisis, is that there has been funding that's been put into tech industries. But again, it's been privately owned tech companies to set up social responses to the COVID crisis. Now, what if there was a regular stimulus? What if there's regional banks or combined authorities that had the ability to finance those models? We'd see a real different makeup of our businesses on the ground. And Paul mentioned the food industry, and that if you really lift the lid of how broken the food industry is at the moment, you'd see how vulnerable that we are. And there is a genuine worry amongst some people that by summer we're going to see food shortages. And so we need to look at the industries that are vulnerable, that are vital to human existence. So energy is another one, and so I'm a cooperative, and I'm someone who will always champion the bottom up community led approaches, and I want to see community owned energy companies. But again, that you need access to capital to be able to do that and to do it at scale.
Thank you, Jessie Jo. That's great. Just before I go to Alex, if anyone has any questions for the panel, please do send them into the chat and we'll have a look through. We are fairly limited on time. So we'll try and pick the ones that are most appropriate to the discussion we're having. But let's go to Alex.
Okay, so it's a really interesting discussion that we're having, really picking at the bones of capitalism and really what we mean by socialism, social democracy, and where the dividing line is, which is a real big current debate in this area. I'm just noticing that I seem to be in the corner, not in the middle, so I'm worried about a YouTube thing, but that might be just because I'm in control of the YouTube. So hopefully it's working properly. I've got Steve in the middle of my picture, so hopefully everyone on YouTube can see me, not Steve. Anyway, so my socialism, I always say that my problem isn't in the market mechanism as a means of exchange. It is about who owns the actors in the market. And actually, this crisis is bringing that to the fore. And both Paul and actually everybody, Paul and Rachel and Jesse Doe all touched on it. And I think that the important thing that we can take from this crisis is that we can try and have a new industrial settlement, not just for manufacturing industry, but generally. And we need to think about who the actors are in those markets, who owns them, how they're owned, and how they are financed. So just sort of riffing off what Jesse was saying just now, all of those institutions actually really do exist. It's just that they're not big institutions. So actually, for co-ops and social enterprises and not-for-profit organisations who want to start and develop new manufacturing or other businesses, there is a wholesale bank called Big Sight Capital, set up by Gordon Brown, which we're hearing a lot about Gordon Brown again in this crisis, from the dormant bank accounts money. They've just released 150 million loan, 0% loan package, which I help with as the chair of the Social Enterprise APP. But that's minuscule in comparison to what's needed. And they only did that because they released the dormant bank accounts early. If we're going to have QE, why shouldn't that QE be released to Big Sight Capital, or a proportion of it to Big Sight Capital? Because it is a wholesaler. It doesn't lend itself. It invests in, and this is what I'm going to come to, community development finance institutions. So we're talking about regional investment banks. In Yorkshire, we have a community development finance institution called the Key Fund. Not very big, right? But it exists, and it could grow exponentially if it was vested in that finance, and it could then support this new industrial settlement in our communities. And what I'd like to see actually is a mapping exercise, say, these are all the needs that we're going to have, in the country for this and future crises. And these are the areas which are best suited to develop the manufacturing capacity, production capacity for those. And us as a Labour Party, with the TUC and the unions, and with metro mayors and councils and others, do an exercise and say, this is where our visor factories should go. This is where our 3 ventilator factories should go. Obviously, we're very focused on what's needed in the crisis, but all those other things that we need to make. So, obviously, for climate, this is where our wind turbine blades are made, and this is where our hydropower parts are made, or whatever it is. And so we can. That's how you develop industrial strategy. You don't develop industrial strategy by saying, well, the market will just provide it. We'll just put some money into the market. We'll let those big people like Macquarie and the financial sector decide where the money goes. But I also think there's a much bigger thing here, because we always have these crises of capitalism, don't we? But this is different because we're all living through it. Well, not quite at the same time, but sort of in a sort of stepped way. So we're slightly behind where Italy and Spain are, and the Americans slightly behind where we are, and all of that. And then we don't know where it's going to go next globally, but everybody's living through it in a similar way. Apart from if you're Belarus and you're in lockdown, right? Or partial lockdown. So people will come out of it having the same view. And it's a real shame that we've left the EU. But I think that voters in the EU and people in the EU are going to start thinking differently about the structure of their society. And we're already beginning to question, and I already see it everywhere, how come Germany has weathered this a lot better? Well, part of that answer is the landers and the way they do finance and the way they structure their industry. And so we're all going to have to think about that. But even the Germans have struggled in certain areas. So we're going to have to think about going beyond that. And I think there is a conversation for the Party European Socialists about our approach and our common approach, and actually being cooperative and working together and developing this new industrial settlement. And I think that we in the British Labour Party need to be at the forefront of that, not just because we're the largest party in terms of membership, but because we've got new leadership, we've got new dynamism, and we've got all these great, shadow ministers and Annalise who understands all of this, and we need to push it forward and have that debate. And once we're out of this lockdown, I think that we need a across Europe to be having this debate, even though we are not part of the union.
Thank you, Alex. It's all fascinating answers, and it's a good example of how it's important to be thinking about the strategy for when lockdown and when the virus is over. Which often we're told this isn't the important thing right now. The important thing is just about getting PPE or to the NHS or whatever. But we do need to be thinking about these issues now. I'm going to open up the conversation, and we've got some questions from some of our members here. The first question I'm going to take you off mute is Matt Shannon, please.
Hey, so obviously pollution has gone down because of the economic turndown, and at the same time, there's not much political bandwidth to discuss the climate crisis right now. Do you think there's any way we can attempt to bank the environmental effects we've seen post-recovery?
Thanks, Matt. Can I put that to Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand that we could very rapidly see the reverse of the kind of climate change that we have seen over the last month, and therefore, particularly as people, for instance, won't be wanting to use public transport because of the social distancing and wanting to protect themselves. So this comes really on to looking at, I believe, our kind of relationships, and it leads a little bit from the conversation that Alex has just led, because what we have to recognise is that we're not going to be able to do this alone, and we need to build this kind of new federalism, not just talking about our own kind of relationships, but what are our global relationships as we move forward, and we need that inter-cooperation as we set forward an agenda, and whether it's climate or a pandemic or some other global emergency, whether we're talking about food or development, we cannot be now isolationists in this new world and believe that, the great I am UK, which is very much the narrative of the government, can lead us into this new world. We have got to look at the global inequality which has developed over a sustained period, no matter which administration has been in power, and then how do we ensure that we are bringing closer collaboration across perhaps many of the developing countries, as well as obviously the developed world. So this is very much an opportunity of resetting our global relationships as well. Now, there are many challenges within that, no doubt, as we see with the States and other countries really determined to kind of America first and putting their own agendas at the forefront, but where we can bring those new relationships and alliances, because clearly there are going to be fresh challenges within the European Union as we move forward as well, because clearly the economic model of Europe is also unsustainable. So can we bring forward that new expression of cooperation across Europe and across other like-minded nations, and bring on new partners in order to start looking at issues such as climate, food, pharma would be a really good example as well, so that we have got some control over those major components which are going to be key in developing a new economy. So whilst we may be grieving the loss of the EU, actually this could be an opportunity for a new generation of new relationship, a new federalism, a new way of inter-cooperation with a much wider cohort of nations, to start addressing the gross inequality of which clearly the UK and others have prospered from on the backs of other countries. So I think we've got this opportunity to really drive an agenda, and particularly, climate would just be one classic example, but I think there are many other examples we can put at the forefront of how we foster those new relationships.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, Paul, I think, hang on a minute. We've just lost you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we've got you now.
I think people will want cleaner air, quieter skies, more sustainable economy of food. Everybody's baking, apparently. But we've got to be aware of this, before this started, there was a culture war in Britain. It's still there. And we as a movement are going to be really careful that we don't. I mean, yes, I want to be able to say, right, on this basis, Heathrow should have far less flights. You know, we don't want a bunch of people coming into Heathrow, you know, until we know, you know, how do you control this virus. So the skies above me will remain clear, and there's usually a sparrowhawk in central London circling, which there never was before. So that's great. But if you live in a small town where there is nothing anyway, this is a terrifying prospect. And what I think is, I mean, Alex is slightly missing from his picture, but Rachel, you know, I think people in the PLP will know that what's been coming in to the new shadow cabinet is a lot of stories about people in pro-Brexit constituencies saying, fuck Labour, why are you politicising this? We just want to get this over with, get back to normal, don't criticise the government, and above all, I would imagine, you know, don't start, you know, banging on about this being an opportunity to have less economic life. You know, if you're a Uber driver or an air steward on you know, Flybe, which has just closed down, you look at those clear skies and you think, shit, you know, my life's just ended. No, I think, in other words, I genuinely caution against trying to make it front and center of the left's narrative that the environmental effects of this are actually quite good, although they are. We've got to try and take people with us to the other side towards an economic model, and it's exactly where Jesse Joe was talking about. I think where we're making inroads into those communities is where they are being thrown back onto their resources, and you know, I don't want to caricature anybody, but you know, what do people say when they're sort of anti-Corbyn? You know, it's often people who are very focused on family and community. And they are being focused back on family and community. And we need to go with that just as much as we need to go with the clear skies.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Jesse Joe, I mean...
Yeah, I totally agree with...
You mentioned a lot about mutual aid groups.
Yes.
But there's also this idea of people sort of looking through their curtains and telling on the people who go out for a walk 3 or 4 times a day, which is the other side of the culture war Paul is speaking about. You know,
yeah, and there's definitely there's both happening at the moment, and I think it's our job to cultivate the value system that we know that the future and the brave new world will be built upon, and that value system is solidarity, cooperation, care, compassion, looking after each other, collectivism, and so in tackling, I think it's right that what Paul said, we don't talk about climate change at the moment. It isn't useful. People are suffering. People can't eat. People are losing their jobs. People are having to wait 4 hours to try and get universal credit. It is a really, really challenging time for people. But at the same time, in this contradiction, there's also some beautiful things, and families are seeing more of each other, and they're eating together and they're walking together, and they're not, you know, they're not working 24/7, and the workers that are, you know, at the forefront of this crisis, the ones who were underpaid and undervalued are now our heroes. So there's a real shift in priorities, and for us to ever tackle climate as a region, as a nation, as a globe, there has to be a shift in priorities. We have to move away from just complete turbo consumption, and that is what's happened. And actually, you know, when I think about, will people rush back out to Primark to just buy and shop after the crisis? I'm not sure. And so it's, how do you cultivate some of those basic values going forward, and in, again, tackling climate, some the adaptation and the relinquishment of how we've lived is also always the conversation that has been needed to happen. And in some ways, if you know, just me personally, if I now start to think about relinquishment, it doesn't feel as difficult as it did 4 weeks ago, because we've learned that we can very quickly adapt as a species, and there's something in that I think that's where the the capital that draws into the climate change conversation could potentially happen. And it's something to remember this period, but not to necessarily have that conversation now.
Thank you. Alex?
Hi, yeah, I mean, just to follow that, you know, as the Shadow Minister for Tourism, what we're seeing now is that tourism's taking, you know, huge hit in this country, from top to bottom. But if we think about it now, people who might have before thought that the only holiday they could have was a trip to Bali, now, you know, sitting on Brighton Beach or going to Lake Windermere seems pretty good, doesn't it? You're stuck in your house. So I think that we can maybe look at it from the other end of the telescope and say, well, we've had this really difficult period. And as a nation, we need this national effort to rebuild. So part of, you know, looking at those groups that might not naturally, that we might have lost or naturally have deserted us over the last few years, we can rebuild with them by talking about having a united national effort to rebuild, but also to look at things like where you go on holiday, or what you do with your leisure time, or instead of, you know, looking at consumption, looking at community. And so you can build some of these things which people might think is more communitarian, but in a different sort of way and in a different context. And the right will be doing some of this as well, let there be no doubt, but we can do it in a very different way, and we can build values around it in a way that they can't. All they've got to bring to the table really is sort of nationalism or national pride, if you want to soften it, while we've got a whole set of values that we can put behind it around, you know, much deeper sort of feelings of commonweal, of community, and of solidarity, and of equality, you know, and you can contextualize that in the crisis, because, you know, actually, although I hated the phrase at the time, is use of it, David Cameron said we're all in it together. Well, we actually literally are now. You know, although it isn't a massive lever. I was listening to an interview yesterday with Melinda Gates, and she was quite embarrassed about some of the questions she was being asked about whether she had enough, you know, had enough food and stuff. Clearly they do, you know, at the Gates mansion. But even the Gates have to stay in their gated community, you know. So it is to an extent a leveler, although it's not a real leveler, but we can actually take it forward to that next stage, I think, once we've, you know, through this point of the crisis.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose we've seen people like Orban in Hungary taking advantage of the crisis to, you know, to get rid of the democracy in their countries, and you know, Donald Trump's not far away from that, and Bolsonaro and people like that. What, you know, so the right, the nationalist right, are certainly going to try to use this for their advantage. And how you know, what answer do we have to that? And I know you answered that partly, Alex, but does anyone have any contributions? What answer we have to that you know, these attacks on democracy that are now going on across the world? Rachel, any?
Well, again, what we have to look at is kind of how do we meet need at this time, and that's where the political shift will be. And if we think at the moment about kind of obviously the wave that kind of hit our inboxes first and our constituents first was kind of people's kind of survival through this, and the fact that people, whether they're kind of been building up their business over some time, and they were the first people to kind of suddenly find themselves bummed out of any security, and having that recognition that actually the world that they had built is no longer sustainable for them, and certainly they cannot see the horizon at the moment. I think we can see with all of the kind of small businesses, they just don't know, and when they look to us, we don't know either for them. And I think certainly if we're going to come back into looking at how we can build some of those securities, which then leads into you know, how do you build a politics? We've got to look at the models in which we are going to give those opportunities. So that whole kind of community wealth building model would be an example of saying, actually, we're going to put local first, which then builds back into that community kind of collective response. So people will understand, you know, the electrician down the road hasn't got any work, so we want the electrician down the road to be able to operate, you know, within our communities. It's those kind of responses which I think will then build a politic which can then respond more on a wider context. So I think that's kind of certainly where I think we need to put our emphasis and looking at those kind of economic models, which are about reinvestment in and refinancing in such a way to build sustainable communities. And that may be a way of kind of starting to build back, not losing sight on the kind of the macro picture we're wanting to build. But I think at a local level, that's how you would get your participation back. Now, clearly, there are people, of course, within every crisis, there are going to be people which will have their own political agendas. But I think what we've got to do is articulate space where people can see where they fit into the picture. And I think at the moment we're all in this place where we just do not know what the shape of our kind of collective response is going to be, and therefore people are floundering around saying, what is the future? And I think we've got to very clearly articulate that to people about how they're going to get their money, their society, their life back. And of course, values would have changed. And I think we recognise that. So, you know, we've got to think about the micro as well as the macro in parallel as we're kind of reshaping our society.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to go to Amrita, please, who's just got a question, come back on one of the points Paul made earlier.
Hi. Hi, thanks, Steve. So, Paul, I think you responded partly on the chat to this question, but earlier you mentioned the idea of printing money. And I guess my question would be, you know, we've had cases in history. Germany, for example, comes to my mind in history lessons, where money printed without control does lead to hyperinflation and a lot of instability in a country. And I'm just a bit worried that if we kind of explore this, if we did implement this policy of kind of printing of money to without control to solve this crisis, same hyperinflation could start again, leading to the same instability.
So yeah, I mean, we should probably have a whole discussion about this, but let's understand what's happened so far. After 2008, all major states started to, let's call it print money. The central bank invents money and it buys the state's debts in the marketplace. It doesn't buy them directly. It buys them off, say, a pension fund. What that was there to do was to effectively reduce interest rates below zero, so that, and that's what started to happen. So if you have money, I have a pension, my pension, there's no return on it. There's no returns on the money I've invested by my pension already for 12 years. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So in the last month, what they've done is printed about a third more. And this time they didn't do it to sort of try and restart growth and sort of reprime the markets. They did it as a panic measure to try and stop capitalism collapsing. So that's where we are. The point is that in answer to your question, that we are in a long-term deflationary environment. That there's very little growth, there's very little productivity. The workforce has no pricing power, so wage bargaining is on its arse. And most mainstream economists think that there's very little, there is some, but there's very little risk of doing more quantitative easing itself leading to, say, hyperinflation. But what it can lead to is that there will be inflation. And the question there is, who wins the battle of inflation? Does the working class win by suddenly it's got, it's trying to catch up, it's trying to do wage demands? If it does, actually, that's quite benign over time, because it means that the government's debts, which do need to eventually be eroded, are eroded by inflation. Who loses when the government's debt is eroded by inflation? The people who lent the money, and that is people with pensions. So what you would get in a period of inflation, even if it happened, as long as it's not hyperinflation, is arguably you get a transfer from the elderly population to the young, which, I'm not advocating it, but I'm saying as long as it's, a few percentage points, that's not a tragedy. But the danger is, and actually this is the danger that's already happened, the danger is that we're in a period that's so risky that what happened on the 18th, 19th of March is that billions of pounds started to flow out of the British economy back to the USA. And the Bank of England basically had to do emergency quantitative easing just to stop that. No, in the end, I think that remains, it's always, as we know, for a socialist government, that's one of the biggest things, capital flight. And actually, there's even a danger as each country just ramps up quantitative easing that capital flight starts back to the United States. This is particularly problematic for the Eurozone at the moment. I mean, that we could, again, I don't want to hog the mic, but there is a rational fear that the Eurozone breaks up because of this, because the German government just will not guarantee the debts of the Italians. And therefore, the Italians can't borrow and spend their way out of the crisis. And this is causing huge problems, even for the left in Germany. But that's the subject for another discussion.
Thank you. Paul, I know that you've got to leave quite soon. So I'm going to just add another question that's on a similar basis from Timothy. Tim Sykes, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, so I'm in China at the moment, which is further along this path we're leading, and the restaurants have reopened in the country. Entertainment stuff is closed, but something that I've noticed and everyone is noticing is the lack of consumer confidence in going out and using these businesses in the short and medium terms. This is also going to happen in the United Kingdom. And so my worry, my concern is when lockdown finishes, that's going to be the start of, I think, a rapid, what is possibly a rapid decline in the economy. And I was just wondering what the left, what the government can do to ensure that people are coming out and spending money. And I'm trying to use as many local businesses in China as possible. But I'm really, really concerned about the lack of spending that is going on.
Thank you, Tim. Paul, we'll come back to you because I know you've got to go quite soon.
I do, and I'm sorry I lost you there. That's really interesting. That's new intelligence to me, and it tells you where this is going, because I think that's going to be the case here. Lots of people will, they just start cautious. They'll save more. They'll stop. If you're thinking about a big purchase, you're thinking, oh, I might have a new car. Who's going to do that? In this situation. Likewise, they, oh, in September I might get back to holiday time, right? Well, every year I go to one island in Greece. Do they even want me? Do they even want a 60-year-old person with a heart disease to turn up in Kefalonia in September? I doubt it.
It looks like we've lost Paul just for the moment.
Yeah, so that was it. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Yeah. Good luck. Anybody has any more questions? Just fire them at me.
Great. Jessie Jo, can we come to you on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point, and I do think it's a reality check that it isn't going to go back to normal any time soon. And in some ways, like we probably have to be thinking, this is why a lot of the work that I've been doing behind the scenes is trying to get like local independent businesses online and being able to meet the demands of kind of retail and consumption, but that not being completely owned by the Amazons and Asdas of this world, because I'm really concerned that those small local businesses, those restaurants, that I think just add to the vibrancy, to community in a very different way to just the commodification of food, and so we have to save those. We have to save, you know, with Alex with his tourism agenda, and you take away those independent shops and businesses, you take away the heart of a high street, you take away the heart of a town, and so it is really worrying that I think consumer confidence will be very low. And actually one of the big things that I think we really need to push for, and as a opposition from bench, is about rent moratoriums for those businesses, because, you know, the food and drink sector in London are asking for 9 months free rent. Like, the people who are still going to do okay for now are the landlords. It's completely sporadic. You don't know who, you know, there's no sort of one rule for, there's one rule for one and one rule for another. So we absolutely have to put the pressure on for that, because to enable those businesses to survive, we have to look at reducing their costs for much longer than the crisis will last for. So that's why we're talking about 9 months, about rent-free periods, even looking at you know, the sort of energy costs and utilities. There has to be much more of a support package for the long term, not just the period of the coronavirus itself.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and Rachel, you represent a place that's full of small businesses and small independent businesses. And what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to also be very mindful. People's values have changed, and people will not be going back to the same lifestyle they had out of necessity and uncertainty as to their future as well. And I don't think we can just presume that the models of our communities are going to continue in a slightly different way. We've also got to be really mindful that we could see a growing inequality, which is growing here, because obviously we know, you know, the dependency on universal credit has grown. We know that people are living much more by the margin, so there are people whose disposable income has all but evaporated. So, and some of those will be those businesses themselves who have very much been on our high street, but also the wider community. And I think what we could see emerge, if we don't put the right stimulus in place and support in place, is that some people will continue with a kind of a form lifestyle, you know, investing in kind of the little independence on the high street. And I think we're already seeing some of that, you know, home deliveries and all the rest of it. But there will be then an increasing number of people in our communities who will just not have a franchise at all within, whether it's retail or other parts of our civic society. And I think we have got to be very much the guardians of ensuring that we emerge from this in a more equitable society. And we've got a danger, therefore, of people becoming even more divided. So I think we have got to look at how we have that more inclusive society as we move forward. And it will mean that some of that underpinning, which some communities will need to be even stronger. So whilst I obviously kind of applaud what Just Joe is doing, I think there are some inherent dangers within that as well, that we've got to be very mindful of if we are going to try and get a fairer, more equitable society and stop the social economic divides that we've seen, you know, for the last at least 15 years, but I would say probably over the last 40, 50 years.
Thank you, Rachel. Alex, as our new shadow Shadow Minister for Tourism.
To be honest, I'm trying not to be a tourism bore and on my brief. But I actually think, you know, that something that underpins this is Bank of England said that we've seen a 35% drop in output since the beginning of the crisis. And then we're expecting lockdown to loosen and then to go into a recovery phase. But there's a real chance the recovery phase won't be a recovery phase. What happens if, as Tim says, consumer confidence doesn't come back? The furlough scheme finishes and people are just let go of. Then the bottom's going to drop out of that confidence because the unemployment rate is going to shoot up. People are going to buy less. People are going to be worried about their jobs because they're demanding their businesses going. And so you're going to get a spiral decline. And actually, we talk about confidence, things like bars and restaurants and businesses. The confidence, the more expensive the item is, the less confidence we'll have to buy it. So let's think about the housing market. Who in that circumstance is going to buy a house? So we're going to see decline in house prices, lack of confidence, people sitting on their houses, not putting them up for sale. But we've still got builders building houses, haven't we? I mean, we've still got construction sites ongoing. The state's going to have to step in. Otherwise, we're going to see catastrophic loss of jobs in the construction industry as well. And so what can the state do? Well, we know what the state can do. The state can build tens or hundreds of thousands of social houses, council houses. And this will mean, and this is what happened after the First World War and after the Second World War as well. The state stepped in and plugged the gap, not just because of the need for housing, which we all know we need, and the crisis again, showing that the people with the gardens have a class advantage of those without. The young who are set in expensive rental property, without even a balcony, are looking at, I'm afraid to say, the baby boomers, their big gardens going, look, this is the inherent injustice the crisis has highlighted. So there'll be a societal push as well. But we can also think about, going back to Matt's question, about the climate crisis. We're going to need these houses quickly. We're going to need the jobs quickly. How do we do that? And how do we meet the climate crisis? Because the way we build houses now is frankly rubbish. We build them in big factories, in places actually like East Yorkshire, in old caravan factories, places like that. And then we build zero carbon homes. So, we need to think about this in terms of new industrial settlement as well. We're providing homes, we're creating jobs, we're reducing emissions. On the tourism side, it's the same sort of thing. It's about the fact that the state's going to have to step in and support the industry. And that industry really, if we think about it, quite a lot of that industry is not for profit. How many privately owned museums are there? Very few. How many privately owned theatres outside London are there? Not a lot. What we're talking about, a lot of our cultural industries is already not for profit. So we can build on that and try and enhance home tourism. I'm not saying that guest houses and hotels and B&Bs, the state's going to start, have a state-run chain of hotels. Probably wouldn't be too popular if I suggested that. I'm not trying to do that in our team meeting, Rachel. But but the fact that a lot of the sector is third sector means that the state can step in and support it without worrying about putting money into the hands of shareholders.
Thank you, Alex. Paul Young has a question which I think is an interesting one to finish on. We've only got a few more minutes. Paul, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. It was back end. I mean, should we not be promoting non-profit high streets? I've done a non-profit health business for 20 odd years, never charged a penny to anyone. And I've gone down a non-profit route. CIC is sustainable. It's sustainable in many ways. One, because we don't actually, in fact, need to produce or generate money as we're doing now. And money, as we know, is totally and utterly unsustainable. That's why we've got the crisis globally about economies and the breakdown of economies. It's not just about high streets being non-profit, it's about the community being more non-profit orientated, to be able to supply services, resources to our, I put down earlier on, the NHS is, I think, about the 4th largest employer in the world. Yet we make damn little for our NHS. Why? We've got people who want work, who need work, we need work. We can be self-financing on a non-profit basis to be able to supply NHS, our cafes, our restaurants, all with a great communal aspect. It's communism, not just strictly because we want communism as it has been, which is not quite right for, which is really Russia. But in actual fact, Why do we not talk about a non-profit economy? Low cost, reducing community care, concern, and the development of people, and so we can all flourish as a nation. And if you read a report today about windmills, about windmills, we can actually, in fact, produce 5 times more than we need, so we can export. So therefore, there's lots of things which can be done if we took away the profit out of our speak, our thoughts, and how we've been built to sort of think since we were born. We may have going towards a solution which is sustainable for the economy and for the environment and for global development, because every single human being is phenomenal, and we all have something to be able to give, no matter what nation you're in, no matter what color a person might be. It doesn't make any difference. We are phenomenal creatures. We can do a damn sight better than this. Let's talk about non-profit. Let's get away from the, let's not talk about economics as a profit-oriented thing. I get very passionate. I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much.
I'm feeling it. I'm with you.
Well, Jessie, what we'll do is we've got just a few more minutes left. So if you can sort of respond to that point and maybe make some closing remarks, and we'll come to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the heart of everything that you've just said. It is about understanding a mixed economy, and that not-for-profit cooperatives, community businesses need to be at the heart of an economic strategy for the future for the left, in my belief. And I think you articulated that brilliantly. So a few ideas to think about. I will be setting up a community business hub, a business for good hub, to encourage better practices of private companies, but also not-for-profit, and to support people who want to set up companies, but with a social value to it. And I think finally the point that you made as well is that we are compassionate individuals. We are people who, it's not just about profit, it's about people. And so if we can take anything into the future, it has to be about putting people at the heart of decision making at every level, at local, regional and national government level. That will be the game changer. And I would love to see high streets with a mixed economy of not-for-profit organisations, community businesses, boxing clubs, gyms, gin bars, and indoor crazy golf. Like let's see High Street as a new centre for community, but the big challenges are how you make that work in a policy way, and the big challenge comes back to landlords and land ownership, and who owns the buildings and who owns our high streets. And that's something that I think we need to provide the answers to. So I won't take any more time, but it's been really good to join you on the conversation. Follow me on my Facebook page, Jessie for Mayor. Come and campaign with me next year. I'm passionate about making sure these policies get into action, and by May next year we could actually be in power at a local, regional level to make some of these things happen.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jessie Jo. And it's May next year that your election's going ahead.
Yes, so it's been postponed.
Right.
It's been postponed a year. So yeah. Okay.
Well, we all wish you very good luck with that. I'm sure many of our members will be up to help campaign with you. Thank you. And Rachel, can I come to you?
Yeah, Paul, I think you articulated a vision so well for what our communities could look like in the future. And I think we've got to think not just cities, but think about our towns as well, and about what those expressions are about real kind of community assets that we want to see within each kind of level of conurbation. And one word of caution, though, throughout this crisis, one of the things that I've particularly observed when I was covering the employment rights brief in particular, is that what it has driven is a kind of an underworld of employment as well. So we've seen kind of the warehouses and the retail sector absolutely booming the kind of the warehouse, very low wage culture, and we have got to mitigate against that, because there is a danger that we're just driving the bad guys on the high street underground, which are even going to behave worse than they do ready, and that source of almost slave labor that we've seen, that we know the Sports Directs of this world and others who fit into that category. So I think we have got to be aware that industry could boom if we move it from the high street into the warehouses. So that's just the word of caution. But I go back to my initial comments about ensuring we have got control and agency over what is happening, because if we're not having those conversations now, whether it's with local authority, national government, or across community and businesses, we will not have a voice and direction of where we're going. And we need to have those conversations within communities, but also within a national framework about the kind of society that we want to see emerging, where we put those fiscal stimulus. And I hear very much what Paul is saying about the kind of the macro economic investment that we need to see as well, or else we're going to see a replication maybe of the bad and not necessarily of the good. And therefore now's very much the time to have those conversations. I don't think we're talking anytime soon about seeing kind of lockdown ending and civil society getting back to where it was. But what it does do is create the space for the dialogue about the kind of society we want. And we've all got responsibilities within our own community to drive those conversations forward, no matter who we are, what role we play. And very much want to capture that vision of a new values that we emerged with from this, which is very much more about one anothering, as opposed to where we've come from, which was all about the kind of the me culture. And I think we've got a real chance to lay out, once again, Labour's values, and very much put that at the forefront of what we want to see emerge. Thanks ever so much for the invitation to join you. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you this evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks very much for joining us. And finally, we'll go to Alex.
Thanks, Steve. So, I mean, Paul, I've been on this journey for 20 years supporting corporate social enterprise development, way before I was a politician. Actually, interesting today, I had to go and deliver a vital thing to an Open Labour member in West Leeds, and I turned the corner in Headingley to drive down to West Leeds. There were 3 shops open going down that road from North Lane: Sainsbury's, the Natural Food Store, which is a co-op which I'm a shareholder of, and the Greengrocer, which is owned by the Local Development Trust. So just on that one street in Headingley, 2/3 of the street was not for private profit. I think that's another important point about not for profit a lot. It is for profit, it's just not for private profit, not for shareholder profit. That profit can then be used to support our communities. And that is what they're striving for, creating surplus value, not for individuals, not for capital, but for communities. So, so I think that we need to think about that. And there are lots of organisations that support that already. It's about scaling up. So like you've got Plunkett Foundation, and one of the Plunkett Foundation sort of abiding things that you go to their sessions, they say is, well, when the market fails, then the community can step in. So they support, like, when the local pub closes because they can't run it anymore, the landlord retires and everyone wants to take it on or whatever, the community step in. Now, what are we seeing? I said before, 35% decrease in output. The market is failing everywhere. So the community can step in everywhere and take on that role. As we see, some of these organisations are not going to make it out of this and into recovery, but the things that they do are still going to be needed, and the community can step in. But we need the economic drivers and the source of finance to be able to match that. Actually, I nearly didn't become an MP because about 7 or 8 years ago, I had this great idea with my wife that we're going to set up a social enterprise soft play centre. There's all these soft play centres about, and actually not that many of them. They were absolutely rammed full of kids, parties and all of that. And actually lots of downtime when nobody was using them, or very sparsely used. They were making money, a lot of them were attached to pubs. We thought, well, why can't we turn this into a social enterprise and actually utilise it much better for low-income families in those sort of periods of low demand, and then do all the parties and all that for people better off to redistribute that to run the soft play centre, and it'd be unionised and all that. I doubt many soft play centres are unionised currently. So if anybody out there wants to have an idea, there's an idea for you. Jessie Jo, maybe you can have some social advice soft play centres in Teesside after you're elected. So I think that the opportunities are there. It's just about how we utilise them, how we create the finance, how we. And then the other thing is you don't just turn it on. It's not a tap. People need support. They need training. They need advisors. All of that went. There used to be a whole ecosystem of support, which the coalition government cut. The one place where there's decent support is in Wales, where the Welsh government support, the Welsh Cooperative Centre, and they have something like 70 advisors in Wales supporting people. So they've got a model. They know how it works. We need to replicate that in England, you know. And it sounds like what Jessie Jo you want to do. I'd go to Wales. I'd go to Cardiff and see them. I can put you in touch, see how they do it, because they've got a great model. And actually, if you look at it, even the water in Wales is mutualised because they managed to hold on to a lot more of their not-for-private profit sector. So I think that the real big opportunities, and there's a real big selling job. And the sector itself, although it's really firefighting, it's in crisis now, it's trying to save their organisations. They're out in response to COVID. They're, you know, doing all of that work. They are also beginning to think about this. And I think if we can support them as a party and as a movement to push their voice forward. No, Rachel absolutely will as the Shadow Minister, and I will in heritage museums and then the other parts which I have responsibility for. But if we all do that, then maybe we can actually make this jump, and actually it can, from being a minority sport, the not-for-profit sector can become the Premier League.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all our guests and for everybody for joining us. So thanks to Rachel Maskell, to Jessie Jo Jacobs, to Paul, who left a little earlier, and to Alex. Here at Open Labour, we're having a series of these Zoom meetings. The next one is on Tuesday night, I think, which is Anisha, one of our National Executive Committee members, who will be interviewing Owen Jones. Do join us then. But again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us in this fascinating discussion.
Yes.